Next, we're going to be talking about Enzastaurin. And Nate and Topher, can I welcome you up to the podium?
Thanks everyone, good afternoon. Thank you, Glenda, appreciate the introduction. Would love to start by saying that it's an absolute honor to be a part of this community. You don't hop on a plane, fly overnight, get up at the crack of dawn unless you care. And believe me, Nate and I care about this community in a deep, deep way. By way of professional background, Nate and I have worked together for coming on 20 years in a number of different biopharmaceutical companies. Centocor, which was part of Johnson & Johnson, MedImmune, which was part of AstraZeneca. And over the course of that time, had the good fortune of working in a number of rare diseases. So about 3 years ago, Nate and I made the really wise decision to quit our cushy corporate jobs, to inject massive amounts of risk into our respective family equations, to literally not collect a single paycheck for over 2.5 years, to start a company where our hearts are. And that is to work on what we refer to as neglected pediatric onset diseases. So those are diseases obviously that impact kids, that have no approved therapies, and that have high mortality rates. Just right when we started the company, we had the good fortune of having a meeting with Lara Bloom. It was when you were over from London visiting with Dr. Claire Francomano. And it was just really serendipitous, I think. That's when we learned quite a bit about vascular EDS and the massive unmet need that sits behind that. And it was actually Lara that introduced us to Dr. Hal Dietz. Needy just mentioned this a moment ago. Dr. Dietz's research was really emerging in this quite fascinating way. And so literally Nate and I hopped in the car, we drove down to Baltimore, we knocked on his office door and said, we need to talk to you. We need to talk to you about this disease, and we need to talk to you about this research. So we ended up licensing and partnering with Dr. Dietz around the intellectual property. And just to sort of give you a little bit of a note on what his findings were. The prevailing sentiment was that VEDS was always a structural disorder. You've got this abnormal winding of type 3 collagen, you've got a structural deficiency, and there's nothing you can do about it. And what Dr. Dietz's research has elucidated is that there's actually a second component to the disease. Nigel mentioned it in his talk earlier, which was around the cellular signaling pathways. And so Dr. Dietz's research suggests, at least in the murine models, and again, these are mouse models, but in these murine models, that nature has found a way to beat this disease. And the way that us lay people think about it is this abnormal type 3 collagen is essentially like dry kindling. And that dry kindling is not great, but you can live a normal, healthy life with that dry kindling. It's only when there's a second component to, which is this spark. It's the spark that is this aberrant cellular signaling pathway. When you have spark and dry kindling, that leads to bad outcomes. Well, what if there's a way that we can take that spark out? We can make sure that the spark never happens. Well, that's our aim for this PREVENT study, is to determine whether that's a suitable treatment strategy for VEDS. So with Dr. Dietz's research in hand, it was then Nate's and my job to go out and find the way to dampen the spark. And that came in the form of a protein kinase C beta isoform inhibitor called Enzastaurin. This is a molecule that originated at a biopharmaceutical company called Eli Lilly. And Eli Lilly was studying it in a number of different indications, but to include a disease called diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. They studied it all the way through phase 3 with 493 patients taking 500 milligrams of Enzastaurin once daily for over a 3-year period. And that study revealed that the treatment was effective for the induction of remission, but not the maintenance of remission in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. So Lilly actually put the molecule to the side. One of the critical things for Nate and I was that we wanted to make sure that we found a molecule that had the right safety and toxicity profile. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, Eli Lilly has proven that Enzastaurin is a safe molecule to take for a long period of time. This molecule has over 60 clinical development programs. Over 3,337 patients have been treated with this molecule in clinical trials. And the safety and toxicity profile is really, really well characterized. So then the exercise was to take Dr. Dietz's research, all of the incredible data that sits behind this molecule, and to go and engage the regulatory agencies. Over the course of the last year, we've spoken to the FDA, and we've gotten an orphan drug designation in the US and a safe to proceed letter that the clinical trial can go forward, as well as a fast track designation. We held a European Scientific Advice Meeting, or SAM, with the EMA. The EMA granted us orphan drug designation in Europe, as well as a safe to proceed letter across the 5 countries we're planning for the clinical program. This is a little bit of what the upcoming clinical trial is going to look like. We plan to randomize 260 patients, all with a confirmed COL3A1 mutation, ages 18 to 60, and a small cohort of 12 to 17-year-olds. Half of those patients, which is the standard for a randomized controlled trial, will be on Enzastaurin 500 milligrams plus background of standard of care, and the other half will be on placebo plus background of standard of care. The primary endpoint is time to intervention for these arterial events that have been well characterized throughout the course of the day: dissections, aneurysms, pseudoaneurysms. We will also collect data on the rates of intestinal rupture, pneumothorax, and retinal detachment, and of course safety and tolerability. This shows a map of the countries that are going to be participating in the global clinical trial. You see USA there. We've got France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Netherlands, as well as Sweden. Our intent is to have around 30 or 35 sites across the globe, approximately 18 of those in the US and the rest spread across those 5 European countries. We anticipate that out of the 260, just about half will come out of Europe and half will come out of the United States.
I'm going to pick up where Topher left off and talk a little bit about the clinical operations, but before I do so, I just wanted to extend a debt of gratitude for everybody being here today, and to the comment earlier, sharing your voices. So let this be the beginning of many conversations and input from this community so that we can not only design, but execute this randomized controlled trial. So the length of the actual study is 2.5 years, and that was shown on the previous slide that Topher alluded to. What this shows is the startup, or the site initiation and activation, at the centers in the US and in the European countries. What's important about this slide is the fact that we'll be able to cluster these centers in about 3 months worth of time. And the reason that's important, the comment was made earlier about statistical power, and having as many patients early on in the trial provides that statistical power in order to show clinical significance differentiating Enzastaurin as a treatment from the placebo group. And so there will be about 20 sites in the US, and you can see their names and logos here, everybody from the East Coast with Johns Hopkins and the University of Pennsylvania, all the way to the West Coast with Stanford and the University of Washington, and of course in the middle of the country with the University of Texas, Houston, and Baylor College of Medicine. Topher mentioned earlier that there will be 5 European countries involved, and you can see their representation in the flags at the bottom. For the most part, they tend to aggregate into centers of excellence where there's 1 or 2 trial sites. Closer to home here, we'll have the 2 sites that I've presented earlier. With the help of Glenda and Nigel, with Flora and Needy, we'll have London and Sheffield as 2 available sites for patients to participate. And again, as Topher showed earlier, what that means from a patient perspective are quarterly visits with the site principal investigators, or PIs, and annual images. And so the hope is that this is not dissimilar from the standard of care that you would get. And also, to Glenda's point earlier, we think it's very important that patients be able to maintain the drugs that they're on. So part of this trial is designed to show Enzastaurin on top of the standard of care what patients may be taking. This is a market-by-market breakdown of what it takes to get a clinical trial up and running. And as Jared knows, because we talk to him on a monthly basis, it's a roller coaster of activity, and the good days are great and the bad days are tough. You never know the questions you're going to get from a regulatory authority, but let me give you a little bit of detail in terms of what we've been able to accomplish so far. So in the US, with the FDA, we have what's called an IND, or Investigational New Drug Safe to Proceed letter. So we're now in the process of engaging with the sites that I just outlined previously in order to get their contracting and budget and scheduling up and running. The countries that are shown here, it is a variety of responses that you get. And to illustrate the point, we sent in primarily 2 categories of information to each of these countries. One is provided for the Ethics Commission, and then the other is provided to the regulatory authorities. We heard back in less than 2 weeks from the Netherlands that we're safe to proceed. We are anticipating feedback from the UK this Monday. We got a laundry list of questions from Sweden that are due this Thursday, and we have a laundry list of questions from Belgium that are due a little bit later on, and France haven't gotten around to giving us a response. And so you can see the roller coaster that I was referencing earlier, which speaks to the importance of trying to get all of these sites up and running at the same time. So the analogy that I like to use is it's runners at the starting line for a marathon. What you don't want to have is the first runner go out of the gate and runner number 2 all the way to runner number 260 be delayed by weeks or months, because again, that damages your statistical power or chances of showing an answer to the question, which is, does Enzastaurin work to prevent arterial events in VEDS? So have confidence that we're working on a daily basis to answer all of these questions, and from a general perspective are looking to start the trial towards the end of 2022 or into the beginning of 2023. And the only thing that we can promise you is that of transparency. There will be constant communications with Lara, with Jared, with others, so that we can provide updates as they're coming in. But know that there is work ongoing in order to get this started, again, by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And then lastly, I'll close with 2 things. Here is the acronym for our trial, which we're referring to as the PREVENT trial. And here is the website that I know many of you are familiar with and have been on. And what I wanted to communicate is we're in a little bit of a lull period. And so if you register and you don't hear back, it's not that we haven't forgotten about you. It's that we're doing all of the clinical operations work that was outlined before, so that ultimately we can get the approval of the sites, London, Sheffield, and others, so that they can show up on that particular website and study coordinators can do the very difficult and meaningful work around consenting and screening and ultimately randomize should the patient decide to participate in the trial. But this website, preventvedstrial.com, is up and running, but will be updated as we get those 30 sites in the US and approximately a dozen in Europe, and again, the 2 central sites here in the UK. And as those updates happen, we'll be sure to get the communications out. And should you or your loved one decide to participate in the trial, we will provide as much information as possible so that you can make the right decision, ultimately with your provider and physician, genetic counselor, and team of cardiology care. So the last thing that we'll say is we're grateful for the invitation and to be here. We'll be around the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. To the comment earlier, many of the questions about research or trials are personal ones, and if you would like, we're available to come up and provide more detail about the trial. But we'll end where we started, which was a debt of gratitude to all of you for sharing your lives, your stories, and quite frankly, your counsel on how to execute a randomized controlled trial across the US and Europe. So thank you all very much for the opportunity.